plantation period wasn't just the plantations. It was also this enormous change in how everything was viewed here. Very quickly by the 1870s, what you find is that the private sector consolidates into very, very few families. They acquire property after the Mahele. At the end of that, when they can purchase land, they intermarry heavily among themselves. They basically turf out the island into different families becoming both land dominant and and business dominant. So the Castle and Cook families, for example, basically take over the windward side of Oahu. You have the Campbell family basically taking over Ewa. You have the Damon family taking over the Mauna region. So different families turf out different places. Alexander and Bishop basically take over Maui. Wilcox and a couple of the other small families are basically Kauai. So different places get turfed by different families. And very quickly then, because they're both tied to sugar and then later pineapple generation, and also all the ancillary industries. For example, the Bishop family is not only Bishop Museum and Bishop tied to Princess Pauahi Bishop, but it's also Bishop Bank. So the very quickly, most of these families also become financial hubs. And so the families control everything financially. They call it control in terms of business. They control in terms of revenue streams. And so by the 1870s, the monarchy as a government is almost entirely at the mercy of this private sector industry. So it's not a situation like it is in the mainland United States, where the public sector and the private sector, work sometimes together, sometimes in opposition, but there's always sort of a balance in power between the two. Here in Hawaii, by say 1870, 1875, the public sector, i.e. the government and it's all its related stuff, is very much secondary to the private sector. In that regard, we're similar to a few places like, say, Louisiana and the American South. But then, of course, you had the federal government. So, its closest parallel here would probably be someplace like Hong Kong, where basically under the British colonial system, the private sector pretty much ran the colony. So the same thing happens here, and you see this from everything from education, where the education system becomes pretty much defined by the amount of money that the private sector is willing to put into quote public education unquote. The huge dominance of private schools, which is still a huge factor here today. And of course, in terms of land, the almost every piece of usable, functional agricultural real estate is owned by one of roughly 12 to 14 families. And it could become so consolidated by the late 19th century that you get the term that was in use right into the 1970s of what they call the Big Five, which were the five companies that basically between them pretty much controlled the entire economic structure of the Hawaiian Islands. And that included not only stuff here, but stuff moving in and out of here. For example, Matson, in terms of having monopoly in terms of goods and resources moving in and out, which it did till I think about 8 years ago when Pasha showed up. So these we really were a place owned by companies, in a very real sense, from the late 19th century into the basically 1970s. And that had huge implications. One of the things is it's pretty much the company mentality that is what Liliuokalani is fighting against, and this is why some of the members of the companies get rid of the monarchy is because it's interfering with basically profit revenue sharing. It's not a philosophical thing. It's not a monarchies are bad thing. It's literally a profit. The government was getting in the way of increased profit. So it's sort of a surreal situation in that regard. And this also is seen in the landscape, because if you think of the landscape around here, you don't see a lot of public landscape in the sense of large public buildings. There's a consolidation of, for example, here on Oahu and in Honolulu. But if you go to the other towns and the other parts of the islands, Wailuku, Lahaina, Hilo, the public sector really is not very visible compared to what it would be, for example, in the mainland United States, or even more so in Europe. And this is because the private sector was driving everything. And among other things, the private sector, since they were for profit, were not in the business of putting money into taxes so that it could be spent for the public sector. Now, this had some weird side effects because, of course, the private sector here was entirely dependent on imported labor, Chinese, Japanese, Okinawan, Filipino, Korean, et cetera, et cetera. And so they weren't going to get involved in the issues that you see that were so dominant in the US mainland of racism at the time, in terms of racial exclusion, like the Chinese and such, because that would interfere again with the profit margin. And so what you found is the private sector here unintentionally was really in large part responsible for the development of what would now be called local culture. Not because they were interested in it, but just because anything else would impact their bottom line more. And what this also meant is ethnic segregation was not really very strong here compared to the way it was, for example, even still today on the mainland, where you find even cities like San Francisco, no matter how urban and sophisticated and cosmopolitan they are, still you can move from one neighborhood to the next, and you'll have an Italian neighborhood, and a Polish neighborhood, and a Chinese neighborhood, and a Japanese neighborhood. So this ethnic segregation, which was a huge issue in the U.S. mainland, here in Hawaii really wasn't an issue because, again, if you ethnically segregated places and, of course, the private sector owned all the land, then you might actually impact how much they could sell the property for. So what you find is the acquisition of land, the control of land, the sort of monopolization of ownership of land becomes a key issue. But segregating people is not a big thing because that would be bad business. What you do find, however, is that overlying all of this is this sort of Calvinist logic of being successful, getting ahead, and of course, manifesting that in your built environment is a hugely important aspect of how things play out here. So let's take a quick look at two examples of this. Okay, here we see Chinatown. I don't know if you guys are familiar with, I'm intimately familiar with Chinatown. Chinatown, if you know anything about your local history, was almost complete. This whole section was completely burned down in the 1900 fire, which was intentionally set to get rid of what they thought was a bubonic plague outbreak, which turned out to not quite be accurate. But of course, at the time, they didn't do the fire properly. There was high winds blowing, and the fire got out of control and torched everything everything that's in this picture disappeared. One of the poetic justice parts of it is the wind shifted halfway through the fire because roughly about 7% of the population of Honolulu became dispossessed. No one was actually killed in the fire. But entire Chinatown entirely disappeared, was turned into ashes, and ironically, about half of Bishop Street disappeared in the fire also. So ironically, the very guys, including the department that was responsible for setting the fire, saw their own offices burn up. So what you got is basically you see that here, because if you look at the buildings that are in Chinatown now, you notice that they're all brick and or stone. And Chinatown was the first district in Honolulu that was made fireproof. And the theory was if you made all these buildings out of stone and such like that, if they had a fire, it wouldn't spread through the whole place, which had before been of wood. So again, if you visualize Virginia City from our earlier look, Virginia City was entirely wood, and Virginia City has burned down I don't know how many times, and it's a huge fear of the National Park Service will burn down again. Main streets in the mainland United States were oftentimes made fireproof with brick. The partially was more impressive, more stable, and more durable, but also meant that fire would pretty much be contained in a building. It wouldn't destroy everything. So that hadn't really happened here. Most of Honolulu was made of wood. Chinatown was built of stone and brick, as you see here, to the extent that I think it's probably still a zoning requirement. Now you can't build in the Chinatown district unless it's of fireproof materials. And that was generated in 1901 after the fire. And what you see here is buildings representative of that. Some are 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s, but they still were of that fireproof construction for this. And most of these would have had, you don't see much anymore, but they would have had steel shutters that were called fireproof shutters. So these buildings were built in Chinatown today as a response to the fact that Chinatown was liquidated on government orders in 1900 because there was an attitude that the Chinese were unclean. The Chinese were prone to carrying disease because a lot of people lived in one place together. And so therefore, when they thought that a communicable disease had started up, you just burn the place down. So if we compare this to its alternative, so this is a place with no power. You can still see this. A lot of these places here still have folks living upstairs, businesses downstairs, classic mixed use construction you see throughout Asia and much of the rest of the world. Now we're only 3 blocks away from Chinatown, but this is the commercial street. And what's really interesting about this is very unique it's unique pretty much in the United States. It's very typical. We call primate cities, which is a whole other class. But what you find is again, given the huge dominance of the private sector, If you think of when we're looking at Chinatown, and then you look at this, it's just not. There's little bits of an older, environment, but this is screaming enormous amounts of wealth and power, and this is all private sector. So this is your banks. That's what it used to be Bishop Bank, which is I think now Bishop Trust, Bank of Hawaii, First Hawaiian. All these banks were started by plantation families, and so they all represent this enormous amount of power and wealth that was, sort of institutionalized and entrenched in the private sector, which also controlled pretty much all the functional property in the Hawaiian Islands and all the businesses in the Hawaiian Islands, the plantations. And so what you get is visually what you're seeing here was in a very, very intentional statement on the part of the people that had these enormous amounts of power that just were sort of reminding everyone else that they have this power. And again, you manifest this in the environment, which again is, classically something we've seen that's part of this whole logic of, especially the Calvinist world, where wealth and power should be represented this way. And if you're really wealthy and powerful, you should have your office in the penthouse of the Bank of Hawaii or First Hawaiian building. And you have this enormous amount of power and prestige and status and these enormously, very, very expensive, very, very powerful buildings in many ways. And in contrast, if you go down the side street, so very quickly you move out of that huge echelon of power, which is Bishop Street, and you end up very quickly morphing into something that's not near as powerful. And that's basically your what would be called in other places your public sector, which is basically government. I don't know why we're just having real troubles here. So if we suddenly move for these enormously expensive, very, very plush places, you've got the government, the US government, the Postal Service. You've got Iolani Palace over here, which was the monarchy's last attempt at sort of making a statement of public power versus private power. You've got the very goofy, Hawaii State Building over there. You've got City Hall down here. All these are, many of them are attractive buildings, but they're absolutely, if you think about it, there's absolutely nothing to compare that enormous amount of wealth and power that you saw in Bishop Street that's private sector. This is still a major issue here in Hawaii that basically the private sector has an enormous amount of leverage and power, and the public sector has relatively little compared to almost any place else in the United States. And this is again symptomatic of this. And of course, it's manifested again if we think about it in this built environment. That all this is reflected in this pattern of wealth, power, and if you would, the lack of in other places. On one hand, this might be more attractive in the sense that it's got green and stuff like that. On the other hand, it's they're obviously if you have to get stuff done, this is not where it's going to happen. It's going to happen down in Bishop Street. That's where the money is. That's where you get a car loan. That's where you buy and sell property. Here's where you get forms filled out. And this was even more so in the period when we were the late monarchy, but especially when we were a territory. When we become a territory, they take over Iolani Palace because you obviously don't want any memory of the monarchy, and you turn it into an office building. And one of the main reasons they did that was simply that it saved money because you already had the palace, you weren't going to use it. Don't leave it vacant. Let's use it as an office. And so you had this segregation of power, with power very very much in a very distorted way, locust in these centers of industry, as I think the word was in the 19th to early 20th century, where you've got this enormous power and prestige and status attached to it. And you see this classically with the Kamehameha statue where it goes over here, which is plopped down here in the public sector, whereas wouldn't be really appropriate in Bishop Street, where they would theoretically have statues of Charles Bishop and the other guys who actually made that street. This is why when you go down Honolulu, it's worth having someone, don't do it yourself, but either go through and Google Earth or drive down Bishop Street and just look around and realize how much wealth is there. Those of us that have worked in Bishop Street, it's really striking how much wealth there is versus a block off on either side. And that's still very true today in 2023, just like it was, say 100, 150 years ago. What you find happening here then is not so much government intent or racism in terms of racial segregation, in terms of location, ghettoization, if you would. What you find here is it tends to be very typical in all the towns is one, the plantations were recruited from particular regions. They're recruited from Guangdong province in central South China, southeast China. They recruited from Hiroshima Prefecture in Japan, recruited from around Naha and Okinawa. So what you had was folks that actually, in many cases, actually been from the same town, same region, who then come here to work on the various plantations. They very quickly escape, get off the plantations, try to find a place to settle down, and not surprisingly, they're having a hard time assimilating here. They're going to try to find people that cook the food they like, people that sell the stuff they need, people that speak the language they speak. And so what you get is almost like a centralization, or almost like magnets pulling together similar components. And so you get the Chinatown, you get the Japantown, which is Mo'ili and Macaulay here in Honolulu. You end up with the various groups clustering in different particular areas, because not so much that they're not being forced to by outside forces. In many cases, it's the only place they can afford to because it's cheaper, because they're poor, they're the new immigrant population. But it's also a place where they're more comfortable. They can go into a shop and they can order what they need in Japanese, and they will have Japanese products on the shelves. And that makes you a lot more comfortable for Japanese, because you don't have to sit there and try to figure out, are they going to have it? Which is still true if you go shopping at Don Quixote's, for example. There's a reason it gets the local shopping population it gets, because it has a huge percentage of Japanese products, and even local Japanese are used to eating, Japanese type products versus say shopping at Safeways. So the ethnic enclaves here tend to, in many cases, be more sort of selective choice. And what this means is these groups become more successful. They don't necessarily leave. So as the Japanese, for example, become more successful, they don't really leave Mo'ili Macaulay, a lot of them. They just, buy two lots next to the one lot they already had, and they make the house nicer. The Chinese, in many cases, actually do move out of Chinatown because there's no way to expand there. They move into parts of Kalihi, and then later move into Kaimuki, for example. But then when they do, you find them clustered. So my Hanide family, for example, lives in right in the middle of Kaimuki, and I think of the 8 houses around them, I think 7 are still owned by other Chinese families that all you know, left to settle in Kaimuki at the same time and wanted to be near the Chinese. So what you found was selective choice putting people together. Having said that, these folks, unlike almost anywhere else in the world, tend to then very intermarry to a great extent. And so what you find is you have ethnic enclaves, but they tend to be very confused, I suppose, compared to most places, because intermarriage is actually more common here than marrying within ethnic groups for most of the ethnic groups. So you might end up in a part of Kaimuki that appears Chinese, but you'll find that people living in the houses will be Chinese, Hawaiian, Portuguese, whatever, and their neighbors will be just as complicated. And so what you find is the ethnic enclaves don't really get going. What happens is rather than that, what they come is they become segregated economic enclaves. So what they become is very much defined by how much money you make. The only difference with this compared to the mainland, where how much money you make still defines subdivisions, for example, the ones we looked at, we're looking at American landscapes. You can pretty much define an American subdivision up to about $10,000. 20 or 30 grand more, and people will move into an will move upscale to a nicer home in a more upscale neighborhood. So this, classic 3 to 5 year migration pattern in American mainland US is defined by the desire, the pressure to upscale yourself and improve yourself, very Calvinist, into a newer, more expensive home in a nicer neighborhood. Oftentimes there'll be the spin of better schools, et cetera, but it really is, it's basically upscaling yourself. Here, what you find is that if you move into Kaimuki, for example, and you're, local Chinese, Portuguese, Hawaiian, whatever, and you've got your friends around you and your neighbors around you, and you've been there for a generation, in Asian societies, as with Pacific Island societies, you stay in one place. You're not interested in moving. You want to be near the people that know you. You want to be around people you're comfortable with. So, the traditional thing in many areas till recently would be so you don't have to lock your door. And so in that situation, what happens is you very frequently will find here is if you go to places like Kaimuki or even Kapahulu, other neighborhoods, Kalihi, you'll find that what happens is people don't sell their property to move. What they do is improve the property they have. And so what you find is a very different pattern of movement of people here. It's not by accident when they build Kapolei and Ewa and places like that. They're usually not trying to talk people out of Kaimo Kea or Hawaii Kai. What they're trying to do is talk people who are living with their parents or other relatives in Kaimo Kea. Get out of your parents' house and move into a new home in Ewa. And so it tends to be much more of a generational thing. Having said that, it's actually we're the only place in the United States where a large percentage, I believe it's still 40% of folks under the age of 45, or I should say over the age of 20, still live with their parents. Very typical in Asian societies and in Pacific Island societies, it's normal. In fact, it's expected, for example, in Chinese society. But in American society, there's the tradition that once you graduate from high school, you're supposed to move out on your own and become, stand on your own 2 feet, become successful. Again, the Calvinist logic. And so what you get is you have a constant rotation of people, into new homes. Here in Hawaii, that's not the case. So it's actually realtors have to spin house purchasing in a different way here. So you have to use much more sort of concepts of investment or something like that. The idea of freedom really doesn't get people going here the way that it would on the mainland. So urban patterns are very, very different. Now, this pretty much stays the course through the early part of the 20th century, right into the 30s and 40s. Two things make an enormous impact. The first is, of course, by 1900, the major impact of the United States here isn't what you might call the normal American, the American landscapes we've seen. It's the military. The military was and still is an enormous economic and political force here in Hawaiian Islands. The military is the biggest spender of money in the Hawaiian Islands, even more so than tourism. The military is the largest single employer in the Hawaiian Islands, especially the Navy. So, the military here, unlike the mainland, where it's always pretty marginal, even in areas that have large military populations, the military is very much just a part of a whole very complex pattern of public, private, and all sorts of different types of things going on. Here in Hawaii, the other parts are pretty much, absent. And in fact, even today are actually relatively small compared to military spending, military numbers. Military dependents are still roughly between 1/10 and 1/12 the entire population here in the island of Oahu. That's a staggering number compared to any place else in the United States. That part we don't end up with American society coming to the Hawaiian Islands in 1900. We end up with the military coming in Hawaii from 1900 on, and of course with World War II that just gets exacerbated completely off the chart. The second one here, and it's not necessarily unique to Hawaii, but given the actual just sort of physical geography of Hawaii that's really striking, is what happens to the islands when the car shows up.